The late summer heat baked the dusty ground of the county auction yard, pressing down with a physical weight. It turned the air to a shimmering haze above the metal pens and bleached the humor from the faces of the men who stood with their arms crossed, hats pulled low. They were men of practicality, of profit and loss calculated in hide and hoof. Elias stood among them, but not with them, a ghost haunting the edges of a world he had long ago abandoned. He came here out of a kind of punishing ritual, to watch the things he once loved be sold off for parts, a reminder of what could be taken away. For 10 years, his own ranch had been a study in quiet decay. Fences sagged. The barn door hung on one hinge. Dust settled on his wife's saddle, a fine, tooled leather thing he could never bring himself to sell, and the silence in the house was a presence as real and solid as the foundation stones. He had become a man made of that same silence, weathered and cracked like old leather, his grief a dry, constant wind that had scoured all emotion from his face. The auctioneer's voice was a practiced, rhythmic drone, a litany of bloodlines and poundage. Elias barely listened. He watched the animals, the flick of an ear, the roll of an eye. He saw the fear they tried to hide behind a mask of brute placidity. Then, the rhythm broke. A murmur, sharp and dismissive, rippled through the crowd. 2 handlers led a stallion into the ring. It was a magnificent animal, or had been. A deep chestnut, with muscles that still held the memory of power, but it was broken. Its left foreleg was horribly swollen, bent at an unnatural angle, and it moved with a tortured, 3-legged limp. A long, ugly scar ran down its flank, puckered and white against the dark coat. The crowd shifted, a collective turning away. This was not an asset. This was a liability, meat on the hoof destined for a can. What we have here, the auctioneer began, his tone thin with apology, is a stray, found wandering up on the ridge. Got a bad leg, as you can see. We're selling by the pound, folks. Let's start the bidding low and get him moved. But it was not the horse that held Elias's gaze. It was the girl. She trailed behind the stallion, her small hand hovering near its neck as if to offer a comfort she was too afraid to give. She was no more than 15, maybe 16, with hair the color of dry straw and eyes that were wide and vacant, as if she had seen something that had permanently emptied her out. She wore a thin, frayed dress, and her feet were bare, caked in the same dust as the animals. A man in the front row chuckled, a low, cruel sound. Comes with the girl, does he? The auctioneer ignored him. Do I hear 50? Silence. The only sound was the stallion's ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic sniffle from the girl. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She simply stood, a small, solitary mourner for a life already pronounced dead. More snickers rippled through the crowd. Men nudged each other. A broken horse was one thing, but public sentimentality was an embarrassment. They mocked her not with loud words, but with the quiet, shared cruelty of their turned shoulders and smirks. Elias felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of grief that had been dormant for a decade. He saw not just a girl, but a reflection. He saw a pain so total it had no voice. He saw his own shattered world mirrored in her still, silent form. The auctioneer sighed, ready to dismiss the animal. All right then, last call. And then, the impossible happened. The stallion, who had been standing with his head hung low in abject defeat, lifted it. He turned his great head, his dark eye fixing on the crying girl. With a groan of effort that was audible across the silent yard, he shifted his weight. He took a single, deliberate step toward her. It was an act of profound, agonizing effort, a choice made in the face of immense pain. He stopped, his muzzle inches from her shoulder, and let out a soft, low nicker. A gasp went through the crowd. It was not supposed to happen. A broken animal was supposed to quit. The girl finally moved. Her hand came up and rested on the horse's scarred neck. She did not sob or speak. Her thin frame simply leaned into the animal's, and for a moment, it was unclear which one was holding the other up. Elias's voice was rust. He had not used it for much more than a word or two for years. 100. Every head in the yard swiveled to face him. The auctioneer stared, his mouth agape. Sheriff Brody, who stood leaning against a fence post, straightened up, his gaze sharp and questioning. Elias had not bid on an animal since the fire. He had not shown interest in anything living. The auctioneer found his voice. 100 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 150? There was no counterbid. There was only the stunned silence of men witnessing something they did not understand. Elias Thorne, the town's resident hermit, buying a broken horse. Sold, the auctioneer said, his gavel rapping against the wood with a sound of finality. To Elias Thorne, for $100. Elias did not move toward the ring. He simply met the girl's gaze across the dusty space. Her empty eyes flickered with something that was not quite hope, but a fragile, questioning light. The horse stood its ground, a broken guardian, and for the first time in 10 years, the silence on Elias's ranch was about to be broken. The journey back to the ranch was a slow, quiet procession. Elias led the limping stallion, the rope held loosely in his weathered hand. The girl followed a few paces behind, a silent shadow clinging to the animal's presence. She had not spoken a word, not when he'd paid the auctioneer, not when he gestured for her to follow. She simply watched him with those unervingly still eyes. His property greeted them with the same tired neglect it wore every day. The wind whispered through the gaps in the barn walls, a lonely, sighing sound. Elias led the stallion into the main aisle, the air thick with the smell of old hay and forgotten time. The place was a shrine to his grief. Maria's gardening gloves still sat on a dusty shelf, caked with the soil of a garden that had long since been reclaimed by weeds. He worked with a methodical slowness, his hands remembering skills his mind had tried to forget. He fashioned a sling from old canvas and heavy ropes, hoisting it to a thick oak beam to take the weight off the stallion's ruined leg. The horse, against all expectation, stood patiently, submitting to the unfamiliar touch. It seemed to understand. The girl stood in the wide doorway, a silhouette framed by the harsh afternoon light, watching his every move. The silence between the three of them was not empty. It was heavy with unspoken histories, a shared language of pain. As he gently cleaned the grime from the stallion's leg, preparing to set the bone, his fingers brushed against a patch of white hair just above the hoof. It was a peculiar marking, a perfect white sock that ended in a sharp, jagged line, like a lightning bolt. The touch was electric. A memory, buried under a decade of ash and sorrow, surged through him. A small, wobbly colt, chestnut-furred, with that same impossible marking. Maria had called him Stardust. He's got a piece of the sky on his foot, Eli, she had said, her laughter echoing in the phantom space of the barn. The colt had been her project, her hope. He was supposed to have perished in the fire, along with everything else. Along with her. Along with their daughter. Elias froze, his hand still on the horse's leg. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A trick of light and memory. But his heart hammered against his ribs with a truth his mind refused to accept. He looked from the white marking on the stallion's hoof to the vacant eyes of the girl in the doorway. The world tilted on its axis. Later that evening, Sarah came by. She was the town veterinarian, a woman whose compassion was as steady and reliable as the setting sun. She had known Elias and Maria for years, had been one of the few who had tried to breach the wall of his grief after the fire, only to be met with impenetrable silence. Sheriff Brody's truck pulled in behind hers. "Brody called me," she said, her voice soft as she approached the barn. She carried her medical bag. "Said you did something out of character." Brody hung back, his expression a mixture of concern and deep-seated sadness. "Elias," he said, his voice gravelly. "What's going on? Who's the girl?" Elias didn't answer. He just gestured toward the stallion, now resting in the sling, its legs splinted and wrapped. Sarah examined his work, her eyes professionally assessing the clean wrap, the sturdy splint. "You still know what you're doing," she murmured, a hint of surprise in her voice. She looked at the girl, who now sat on an overturned bucket in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest. "Does she have a name?" Elias shook his head. He didn't know. As Sarah tended to the horse, giving it a shot for the pain and infection, Brody drew Elias aside, out into the cooling air of dusk. "I ran the girl's description," the sheriff said, his voice low. "Nothing. No missing person reports fit. It's like she and that horse just fell out of the sky." He paused, his gaze heavy. "Eli, you know I have to ask. You can't just keep her. She's a child." "She wouldn't leave the horse," Elias said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I understand that. Brody replied gently. But bringing them here, it's stirring things up for you, isn't it? He didn't need to say what things. The fire, the loss, the official report that had declared Maria and their 5-year-old daughter, Lena, dead. The 2 small caskets he had buried in the town cemetery. Brody had been the one to deliver the news, his own face a mask of helpless sorrow. Elias didn't respond. He just looked back toward the barn, at the broken horse with the impossible marking and the silent girl who guarded it. The past was no longer a ghost. It was standing in his barn, breathing his air, and he had no idea what to do with it. The doubt gnawed at him through a sleepless night. The image of the white marking on the stallion's hoof was burned into his mind. Coincidence was a thin blanket against the cold certainty growing in his gut. Before the sun had fully risen, casting long, cool shadows across the yard, he found himself in the tack room. It was a place he had avoided for 10 years, a chamber of memory sealed by dust and cobwebs. He ran his hand over the lid of Maria's old tack box, a simple wooden chest she had cherished. The air displaced by the movement was thick with the faint, lingering scent of her leather polish and the wildflowers she used to tuck into her hair. His hand trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, everything was just as she had left it. Faded leather reins, a soft curry comb with a few chestnut hairs still caught in its teeth, a jar of hoof dressing. He began to dig, a quiet desperation fueling his search. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he had to find something, some proof that he was not losing his mind. His fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular at the bottom of the box, beneath a folded saddle blanket. He pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped by time and humidity. He recognized it instantly. Maria's journal. He thought it had been lost to the flames, another casualty of that terrible night. He carried it out into the gray morning light, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He sat on the porch steps, the worn leather cool in his hands. He opened it. Her script flowed across the page, elegant and full of life. The early entries were filled with sketches of birds, notes on her garden, loving, teasing words about him. He skipped past them, his breath catching in his throat. He found the entries about the colt. She'd named him Stardust because of the white splash on his hoof. Like a star fell and marked him just for us, she'd written. She described his spirited nature, his intelligence. It was the same horse. It had to be. Then he turned to the final entry, dated the day before the fire. The handwriting was different. Hurried, tense. My father called again, it began. He doesn't approve of this life. He never has. He calls it squalor. He says I am wasting myself, and worse, that I am letting my daughter waste away in this dust. He offered me a way out, again. An apartment in the city, the best schools for Lena, everything I could want. He thinks his money can buy my happiness, that it can erase Elias from our lives. Elias's blood ran cold. He had known her father, a wealthy, controlling man named Alistair Garrison, had disapproved of their marriage, but he had never known the extent of the pressure he had put on Maria. The entry continued, each word a hammer blow. I told him no, for the 100th time. But his words have planted a seed of fear. What if something happens? What if Elias can't provide? For my own peace of mind, I have to make a choice. Not his choice, but my own. I have made arrangements to sell Stardust. A friend of my father's. A collector who promises a good home. The money will be a safety net, a secret fund just for me and Lena, in case the worst should ever happen. Elias would not understand. He would see it as a lack of faith. But it is not about faith. It is about a mother's fear. I meet the man tomorrow at the old crossroads to finalize the sale. The truth was a physical shock, a gasp of cold air in his lungs. She had been planning to sell the colt. The fire had happened that night. The colt had not been in the barn. It had survived. But the rest of it, the way her father had framed the world, the fear he had instilled in her. A dark, terrible suspicion began to form, a shape too monstrous to fully comprehend. The past was not just present. It was a conspiracy that had been lying in wait for a decade. The sound of an engine, too smooth and quiet for any vehicle in their county, sliced through the morning air. Elias looked up from the journal. A sleek, black truck, polished to a mirror shine, was rolling slowly down his long, dusty driveway. It was an alien vessel in his world of rust and decay. It stopped, and the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit that seemed to repel the dust around it. His silver hair was impeccably styled. Even after 10 years, Elias recognized him instantly. It was Alistair Garrison, Maria's father. Garrison's eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the dilapidated ranch, his lip curling in a faint, unmistakable sneer of disgust. He had not seen Elias since the funeral, where he had stood apart, a figure of icy, judgmental grief. His gaze finally settled on Elias, sitting on the porch with the journal in his hands. "Thorn," Garrison said, his voice as smooth and cold as river stone. "It's been a long time." He took a few steps forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. "I heard you made a purchase yesterday. A broken-down horse. It seems your taste has not improved." Elias rose slowly to his feet, the journal still clutched in his hand. "What do you want, Alistair?" "What is rightfully mine," Garrison said, his tone hardening. He produced a folded sheaf of papers from his jacket pocket. "That Stallion. He was stolen from one of my breeding farms nearly a decade ago. I have the bill of sale, the breeding records. He belongs to me." He glanced toward the barn, where the girl was just emerging, blinking in the morning light. "And I hear you've taken in a stray of the human variety as well. The authorities will be very interested to hear about an unstable recluse harboring a vulnerable minor." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to power. He would not just take the horse, he would destroy Elias, painting him as a disturbed and dangerous man. Just then, 2 more vehicles pulled in. Sheriff Brody's patrol truck and Sarah's dusty pickup. Brody had clearly anticipated trouble. He got out, his hand resting near his sidearm, his face a grim mask. Sarah joined him, her arms crossed, her stance defiant. "Garrison," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "Fancy seeing you out this way." Garrison's mask of civility tightened. "Sheriff, I'm simply here to reclaim my property." He held out the papers. "This man is holding my animal. And that child, her welfare is my primary concern, of course." The allies had gathered. The small, defiant group stood their ground on the dusty patch of earth Elias called home. Sarah moved to stand near the girl, a protective presence. Brody took the papers from Garrison, his eyes scanning them with a slow, deliberate intensity. The air crackled with tension, the morning calm shattered. The past had not just arrived. It had come to lay claim to the present. The sky began to darken, the sun obscured by a bruised bank of clouds rolling in from the west. A sudden, cool wind kicked up dust devils in the yard, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had descended upon the ranch. The standoff moved into the cavernous space of the barn, the scent of rain heavy in the air. Garrison stood in the center aisle, flanked by 2 imposing men he had brought with him, their city clothes looking absurdly out of place. "This has gone on long enough, Thorn," Garrison said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet space. "I have the law on my side. The horse is mine." He gestured to his men. "Take him." Elias moved without thinking, placing himself squarely in front of the stallion's stall. "No," Garrison laughed, a short, humorless bark. Still the defiant dirt farmer. "Do you know what my daughter's greatest fear was? It was this poverty, this nothingness. She was weak, always needed someone to save her from her own poor choices. I tried to save her from you. In the end, I couldn't." The words were designed to wound, to twist the knife of Elias's grief. As Garrison's men took a step forward, the stallion, who had been resting quietly in his sling, erupted. He thrashed against his restraints, letting out a wild, furious scream of a neigh. He lunged, trying to put weight on his broken leg, his eyes rolling with white-hot rage directed entirely at Garrison. The raw, protective power of the animal was terrifying. Garrison and his men flinched back, startled, but the stallion's fury was only the prelude. In the ensuing silence, another act of defiance occurred, one far more powerful. The girl, who had been a silent observer in the corner, stepped forward. She moved with a strange, somber grace, her bare feet silent on the dusty floorboards. She walked past Elias, past Garrison's men, and stopped directly in front of Alistair Garrison. She planted her feet and looked up at the wealthy, powerful man who towered over her. She said a single word, her voice raspy from disuse but ringing with absolute conviction. "No." The stallion immediately fell quiet, his breathing ragged but his frantic movements stilled. He watched the girl, his great, dark eyes soft. She had defended him. Sheriff Brody, who had been studying Garrison's paperwork under the dim light, finally looked up. "There's a problem, Alistair," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Sarah just pulled the auction intake report. The brand on this horse, a small S on the hip, doesn't match the breeding records you've provided. Your papers are for a different animal." Garrison's face went rigid. For the first time, a flicker of panic showed in his cold eyes. He was cornered. "It's a clerical error," he blustered. At that moment, the final, devastating truth was revealed not by a document, but by the girl. Her small hand went to a thin, tarnished chain around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her frayed dress. She pulled it out. Dangling from it was a small, silver locket, oval and dinted with age. With trembling fingers, she opened it. She held it out, not to Garrison, but to Elias. Elias stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the tiny object. Inside the locket were two faded photographs. On one side was a picture of Maria, smiling into the sun. On the other was a picture of a little girl with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. His daughter, Lena. He knew that locket. He had given it to Maria on their first anniversary. The world stopped. The wind howled outside, but inside the barn, there was only a suffocating silence. The girl was not just a stray. The vacant eyes, the straw-colored hair, it was her. Older, traumatized, but it was her. "Lena, you told me she was dead," Elias whispered, the words barely audible. He looked at Garrison, the monstrous shape of the truth finally clear. "She was in the fire. You told me they were both gone." Garrison's composure finally shattered. The truth was written on his face, a mask of guilt and desperate self-preservation. He hadn't just tried to control Maria. When the fire had offered him an opportunity, he had taken it. He had staged Lena's death, stealing her away from the life he so despised. He had raised her in secret, in isolation, to protect her from her father's world, telling her that Elias had abandoned them. The stallion, Stardust, the last living link to her mother, had been her only companion, until he, too, had been lost, only to be found again, broken, in an auction yard. The final truth hung in the air, unvarnished and terrible. The girl in the barn was not a mirror of his grief. She was its living, breathing source. The first clap of thunder broke directly overhead, and the sky opened up. Rain began to fall in heavy, sheeting curtains, drumming against the tin roof of the barn. It was a sound of cleansing, of release. Alistair Garrison stood exposed, his lies stripped bare. His power, built on wealth and intimidation, crumbled into nothing in the face of the simple, devastating truth held in a child's locket. He didn't rage or fight. He simply deflated, the arrogance draining from him like air from a punctured tire, leaving behind a pathetic, hollowed-out old man. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, the clink of his handcuffs metallic and final in the quiet barn. "Alistair Garrison," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion save a deep, weary sense of justice. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, obstruction. We'll figure out the whole list later." Garrison offered no resistance as Brody cuffed his wrists behind his back. His expensive suit was now just the costume of a villain whose story was over. Brody led him out into the downpour, a quiet, pathetic end to a reign of quiet, pathetic cruelty. Inside the barn, the storm raged on, but the conflict was over. Elias stood frozen, looking at the girl, at Lena, his daughter, the daughter he had mourned for 10 years. The weight of a decade of mistaken grief, of a life lived in a mausoleum of sorrow, came crashing down on him. It was too much to bear. His legs gave out, and he sank slowly to his knees on the dusty floor, the worn journal falling from his hand. He didn't make a sound. His body was racked with silent, invisible tremors. The stallion, Stardust, shifted in his sling. He leaned his great head over the wooden gate of his stall and gently nudged Elias's shoulder with his soft muzzle. A quiet gesture of comfort. An acknowledgement. Then Lena moved. She took one hesitant step, then another, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards. She stopped in front of her kneeling father, a man who was both a stranger and the center of her entire lost world. She reached out a small, trembling hand and laid it on his arm. That simple touch was what broke the dam. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped Elias's eye and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Then another. He did not sob or cry out. It was a surrender, a quiet, profound release of a pain he had carried for so long it had become a part of his bones. He raised his own hand and gently covered hers, his calloused fingers engulfing her small ones. The storm wept outside, and for the first time in a decade, Elias Thorne wept with it. Time began to pass, measured not in days, but in small acts of healing. Weeks melted into a season. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The ranch began to change. The sagging fence line was now taut and straight. The barn door swung smoothly on two well-oiled hinges. A small, tidy vegetable garden grew where weeds had once choked the life from the soil. Elias had found a new purpose, a reason to pick up the tools he had let rust. His movements were still quiet, but the heavy, crushing weight was gone from his shoulders. He moved with the steady intention of a man who was not just fixing a property, but rebuilding a life. He was constructing a new round pen in the main pasture, the scent of fresh-cut pine perfuming the air. Stardust's leg had healed. He would always walk with a limp, a physical reminder of his past, but he was no longer broken. He moved with a gentle grace, his chestnut coat gleaming in the morning sun. He spent his days in the pasture, a quiet king in his new domain. An unconventional family began to take root in the silent soil of the Thorne Ranch. Sarah was a frequent visitor, always arriving with a basket of food and a warmth that filled the quiet corners of the house. Sheriff Brody would stop by, not as an officer of the law, but as a friend, sharing a cup of coffee on the porch and watching the world slowly right itself. The final scene of their old life had closed, and a new one was just beginning. One cool morning, Elias and Lena sat on the newly repaired porch steps. She was finally starting to look like a child again, her face less haunted, her thin frame slowly filling out. They didn't speak much. They had a decade of silence to overcome, and they were in no hurry. Their communication existed in shared moments, in the space between words. He was teaching her how to gentle a horse, how to read its ears, its eyes. She was teaching him how to live in the present again, how to see the world not as a collection of painful memories, but as a place where new ones could be made. He pointed a finger toward the sky. "Look," he said softly. "Red-tailed hawk." Lena followed his gaze, watching the hawk's circle in lazy, effortless arcs against the brilliant blue canvas of the sky. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fragile, beautiful thing. He smiled back. The silence that settled between them was no longer the oppressive weight of grief. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of a new dawn. It was not a cure. It was not a perfect ending, but it was a path forward. A first step on a long, slow journey toward home.